Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here in a minute. I'm going to let a couple more people trickle in, and then we'll kick things off. All right, participation looks good. Let's go ahead and kick things off. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's Threat Talk on remote monitoring and management threats. A couple of housekeeping items. This is our monthly customer lunch and learn to provide timely and relevant intelligence on the state of the threat landscape, as well as we're going to be recording this, so we'll get it out to you afterwards, probably later today. But we do also encourage active questions, so pop those through as you think of them into the Q&A box at the below bar. And then at the very end, we'll do this open discussion where we'll answer those Q&A questions, as well as you can add more in when we get to that part. If you have any team members that weren't able to make this, please connect with your CSM or just forward them that recording email that we'll send you, because we want as many people involved in the discussion, as well as we want y'all to get some good stuff out of this. But without any further ado, I'm going to kick things over to JP, our speaker today.
Hey, thanks, Gracie. So just a quick introduction to myself in case you guys haven't met me before. My name is JP Castellanos. I'm the Director of Threat Intelligence here at Binary Defense, and I've been here for about a year and 5 months. Previously, I was a Middle Eastern and North African subject matter expert for an oil and gas major in the Houston, Texas area. And before that, I worked in the DoD for about 15 years. Those last 10 years, I was at U.S. Central Command. I was part of the active cyber defense team, which is a team that consisted of threat hunters, insider threat, and threat intelligence. And to give you more background about my team, me and my team, we come with a total of 50 years of collective threat intelligence experience. Our team does have some very unique capabilities as well. For example, one of my analysts is very fluent in both Ukrainian and Russian language capabilities, which allows us to go into some of the more popular Russian language forums, such as XSS or breach forums, and we're able to communicate with these threat actors without the need of any translation software that would not be able to capture some of the more unique dialects in the Russian language. My team also consists of a diverse set of expertise in geopolitical areas as well. We have analysts that have expertise in China, Russia, as I mentioned before, Iran, in the Middle East for myself, as well as technical subject matter experts that work on spear phishing and ransomware campaigns. So that's a quick introduction about myself, and we can go forward, Gracie. So today's topic is about RMMs, or remote monitoring and management tools. So talking about this problem, remote monitoring and management tools, they do offer a double-edged sword for organizations. These solutions do provide valuable benefits like centralized IT infrastructure, oversight, remote troubleshooting, automated patching. However, these very capabilities that enhance the efficiency can be used by malicious actors and do pose significant security risks. So this presentation is going to delve into the threats and malicious campaigns associated with RMMs. We're going to explore some popular tools, some known threat actors, exploited vulnerabilities, and strategies for threat hunting and response that can be used by threat actors in nearly every stage of threat activity after the initial compromise. And then we're going to talk about the malicious use of these tools and how it presents a very serious threat to target organizations. Lastly, I just want to also add, misconfigured or unauthorized RMMs can pose a very serious threat to target organizations, both due to the powerful access that these tools provide to a victim system, but can also be used due to the benign nature of activity in network logs. Because if you're using an RMM tool, it's supposed to be legitimate software on your network. So it's very difficult at times to catch whether or not the traffic is malicious or not. So it can be very difficult to determine if a legitimate application is being abused by a threat actor, which further contributes to the success and the popularity of these tools and the employment by threat actors. Next slide, please. So basically, an RMM is all your needs in one spot, right? It does awesome services. It does IT security automation. It can do remote access. It can do multi-tenant architecture. It can work on your servers. It can do fault detection, alert escalation. It's kind of like all your needs in one solution. And the popularity of RMMs has really grown over the past decade or so. So you'll see in the next slide a great example of that. Next slide, please. So you got lots of choices here. You got AnyDesk, you got ConnectWise, you got Datto, you got SolarWinds RMM, which I want to say that one's a very interesting one. So with the SolarWinds Enable, we've been seeing in the underground right now a particular vulnerability, and it's classified as CVE 2024 28995, which is a directory traversal vulnerability which has been observed in the underground and is being actively exploited in the wild, according to our sources. So you have plenty of choices, and two that I don't have mentioned here, but are also considered as RMM tools would be Ultra UNC and VNC and Real VNC as well. So this is just kind of just to highlight that you have lots of choices, lots of companies out there. Some you might have seen on the news for certain campaigns, which we'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please. So did you know, right? So this is kind of me jumping off my soapbox really quick. An RMM is basically nothing more than a fancy rat. The only thing is that, you know, rats are not exactly something that's very marketable when you want to sell software to companies. But in the long run, that is what it is. They are basically just a fancy tool, a fancy rat. And as in the image that you see right here, that's pretty much how I kind of classify. It's just me jumping out of my soapbox in case anyone never doesn't understand the difference or never kind of put it together. This is basically what it is. A RMM is a rat. So if you hear me say rat and RMM interchangeably, they're both the same thing. So just want to highlight that for you guys today. Next slide, please, Gracie. So now we're going to talk about who's doing all this exploiting, who is out there doing all this stuff, compromising these RMMs. Well, we got a large group of characters. So we've observed various actors in the underground and ransomware operations, including groups such as Ryuk, Conti, as well as other financially motivated threat actors that will compromise RMMs, such as, for example, Altera, ConnectWise, CASA, and others to basically establish a foothold in their and maintain presence throughout their operations. Now, we've also heard from several sources that several cyber espionage groups have also used legitimate rats in their operations. And this is relatively uncommon to use these public rats by cyber espionage actors, because normally they would use their own homegrown rats to do this activity. But we've been seeing a lot of preference in custom popular RMMs without the use of custom RMMs. So Cobalt Strike Beacon is an example, and these actors may perceive that it's more difficult to detect and accomplish their objectives, which is true. If you're using the legitimate software on your network and it's been compromised by a threat actor, you probably won't know what it looks like because it just looks like legitimate traffic. We've also observed hacktivist threat actors using less sophisticated techniques in their operations, and we've also seen several cases in which hacktivists or unknown threat actors sought to deploy legitimate rats in their operations. So I'm going to go over really quickly these particular groups and kind of highlight some of the things that they were involved in as well. So with Revo and Soda Nobiki, this gang gained notoriety in 2021 for its attacks leveraging compromised CASA VSA software. You got Ryuk, which is another notorious group, which was exploiting vulnerabilities in RMM tools like SolarWinds and Central. Then you got TA505, which is Conti. They basically were using compromised RMM tools for initial access and lateral movement within networks. And then when it comes to APT threat actors, you have Cozy Bear, APT 29. That one is very interesting because we have seen them compromise RMM tools in the past with SolarWinds, which I'll talk about a little bit on this presentation, as well as recent attacks against ConnectWise. You have Lockbit as well. You have Teb Zargos or Static Kitten or Muddy Water. That's a group that I particularly have been following over years, and they've been known to use RMMs as part of their ways to get into target networks. But then you also have hacktivist threats as well that conduct these kind of activities. One example, and this one lies more on the operational technology side of the house. So if you guys remember in February 2021, there was a water treatment facility in Oldsmar, Florida, which is kind of close to where U.S. Central Command is at that time. They were remotely accessed via TeamViewer, and then the attacker, of course, was reported to manipulate the water treatment process by briefly increasing the levels of sodium hydroxide via graphical user interface on the program. And then lastly, you have the criminal underground. Multiple threat actors, and we see this quite daily, they will sell on the underground daily offerings of unauthorized access with admin privileges to victim networks via compromised RMM credentials. So yeah, the exploitation of RMMs being used by both state-sponsored cyber espionage groups and financially motivated threat actors, which include ransomware groups, has been increased. We've seen a significant uptick in the use of legitimate remote access tools such as AnyDesk, Altera, Splashtop, Screen Connect, TeamViewer, NetSupport, and ransomware operations since at least 2021. So yeah, I mean, pretty much everyone's doing it. You know, it's kind of it's a tool in their toolkit basically. So Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about some campaigns. As I mentioned earlier, I was talking about the SolarWinds campaign. And the SolarWinds campaign is pretty interesting. It was a sophisticated attack where Fancy Bear had basically compromised the software updates for the SolarWinds Orion platform, which is a network monitoring tool. And this attack allowed APT28 to gain access to numerous government agencies and private companies and updates containing backdoors. And a little side story as well regarding this particular incident, the company that I worked for previously also used SolarWinds. So they actually were able to get at least the initial C2, but because they weren't a priority target, they did not get the second C2 that was coming in. So that was a bullet that we dodged. But the worst part about that particular attack was it happened during the holidays. I believe that attack happened sometime around right before Christmas. It happened. So it was like all hands on deck when everyone was out for holiday. And I mean, here in the United States, when the holidays roll around, we all take our vacations and everything like that. We kind of take our 2 weeks. That was the opportunity that Cozy Bear decided to conduct this attack. So it was a big impact across, all IT sectors and all industries during that time. Next slide, please. So the next one I want to talk about is the Queso VSA attack. Now, this is a very interesting one. So what happened here was hackers had exploited a zero-day vulnerability in Queso VSA to deploy ransomware across thousands of managed service providers and their clients. So what happened on July 2nd, Queso alerted its customers that there was an incident impacting users of their VSA product and recommended that the customers immediately shut down their VSA servers until further notice. What we found out was that the threat actor behind this attacks were dropping the Sodanobiki installer into machines with Queso VSA and its agent installed. And actors using Sodanobiki had publicly claimed responsibility for the incident based on its addition to the REvil shaming website. We also saw initial reports that suggest that this attack may have been the result of a supply chain compromise, but then further analysis reported that the actors probably just exploited a software vulnerability and rather than introducing malicious code into the legitimate software. So what they did was they took the 0 day and they allowed the 0 day to go ahead and employ and deploy their ransomware. Now, Sodanobiki, just in case you guys might know, is marketed as a REvil ransomware as a service, and the underground forums have been actively distributing this malware ransomware since at least May 2019. And this ransomware as a service is operated by an actor known as Unknown, literally, his name is Unknown, who recently announced that the service would be privatized following negative attention towards ransomware and the bans of ransomware-related posts in multiple underground communities. We've seen these comments, but we haven't seen much change in that. But just to let you know, that's the current situation with Sodanobiki and REvil right now. Next slide, please. So the next one I want to talk about is the TrickBot virtual server campaign that's been going on from 2020 till today. This is basically part of their TTPs. So this is an ongoing campaign by TrickBot, which involves compromising RMM credentials to gain access to corporate networks and then deploy the TrickBot Trojan for financial gain. In October, Lumen Black Labs reported that the TrickBot campaign had targeted remote managing software, and the campaign also introduced a new VNC module to spy on the victims. Now, this VNC module had allowed the attackers to remotely control the victim's computer, view their screen, record their keystrokes, and this gave the attackers access to, of course, sensitive information, such as passwords and financial data. Now, the TrickBot campaign that targeted RMM software is part of a larger trend of TrickBot attacks that we've observed in recent months. These attacks have used a variety of techniques to deliver TrickBot payloads, including phishing emails, malicious websites, as well as compromised software updates. The TrickBot botnet has been disrupted since at least September 2020, but that's one time they disrupted it, but they're still active to this day. But just another example of a threat actor that definitely leverages RMMs as part of their toolkit when they're conducting their activities. Next slide, please. So then we have the Datto 0 day that happened in 2020. Now, this one's interesting because this was a 0 day vulnerability that was tracked as CVE 2020 14248. And what was reported was that the Datto RMM agent allowed attackers to deploy ransomware and gain unauthorized access. But really, this vulnerability was really for a CVE that impacted Ultra VNC and UVNC, which is included in the Datto agent. And this limited exposure, now, according to the sources that I was able to contact, the current version of the UVNC that had the CVE wasn't open to that one. But the danger of DCVs are limited to situations where the attacker was already resident in the system, where the VNC is deployed, meaning the attacker already had to have privileged access to do it. Even though this limited exposure because it's UVNC, even though it was limited, it's deployed by Datto RMM. So the actual tool itself is still vulnerable and can be leveraged by threat actors to work against it. Next slide, please. Then we have our favorite ransomware group, Lockbit. These guys can't stop and won't stop. And this is the Lockbit Screen Connect attack that happened earlier this year. So Lockbit had exploited a severe authentication bypass vulnerability to breach unpatched Screen Connect servers. And then they used that to deploy the Lockbit ransomware payloads on compromised networks. Now, this flaw was known as CVE 2024-1709 and has been under active exploitation since one day after Screen Connect released the security updates. Now, Screen Connect also patched another high-severity vulnerability, CVE 2024-1708, and the Lockbit affiliate either took advantage of the exposed RMM instances or brought their own RMM to the party. And what's interesting in this case is they were using living off the land techniques in order to cement its footing in the victim's networks. In two of these cases, the affected manufacturers disaffected two manufacturers and then also struck a managed service provider, enabling the group to further compromise some of its downstream customers. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we're getting into the APTs now. So this is going to be regarding Cozy Bear. So this is the Midnight Blizzard, for the Microsoft nomenclature, TeamViewer attack that happened in 2024. Now, what's interesting, what I want to say about Cozy Bear is that they definitely do their best to get into the supply chains of any software to then further compromise them. So in this case, Russian spies had breached into the network. TeamViewer actually first announced that Russian spies had breached into the corporate network. The company, which offers remote access tools for businesses, confirmed that the cyber attack was carried out by government-backed hackers known as APT-29. The initial intrusion occurred on the 26th of June, though the credentials of a standard employee within the TeamViewer's corporate account was compromised. Now, the company then stated that we immediately activated our response team and procedures, and then brought in a team of cybersecurity experts, and then implemented the necessary remediation efforts. So this was according to TeamViewer, and so far there's been no evidence of customer data that was affected. But one thing we want to at least highlight is that TeamViewer's functionality and its role within organizations incentivizes this kind of targeting by adversaries. And then this has been leveraged, obviously, by malicious threat actors across numerous threatscapes to conduct initial compromise. Now, even though they do establish network persistence, they try to create backup redundant connections on a compromised network, and then to execute command and control and C2 functions. But I just wanted to highlight this one as well because it's interesting with Cozy Bear how they continue to target the supply chains of organizations such as TeamViewer as well. Next slide, please. And this one's near and dear to my heart. So this one is the Muddy Water RMM campaigns that have been going on since 2020 to 2024. So with this particular group, Muddy Water, which is also known as Temp Zargos, which is also known as Static Kitten, they've been targeting organizations using RMM tools for quite a while. But what we did find now is there's a new cluster of activity that is also associated with Muddy Water doing this. And this Iran Nexus group is known as UNC 3313. And it's a suspected Muddy Water cluster. What we believe, or what I assess, is this is probably an initial access team. So what they'll do is they'll go in, they'll compromise the victims with their RMM tools or compromise the RM systems, and then they'll pass it over to the Muddy Water threat actors to conduct lateral movement or additional exploitation activity. So one thing we found is they're leveraging some remote management software against Altera, and they're also using two new malware families known as Candybox and Jellybean. And this campaign has been targeting entities right now in the travel and tourism and telecommunication sectors in the region. So that's Israel, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey since at least May 2024. Now, the Altera agent and the custom malware are hosted in archives, and these are likely delivered in links to a file sharing platform. Now, what's interesting in this is that on June 10th, the Israeli National Cyber Directorate did issue an alert indicating that the actor that aligns with Muddy Water was using RMM tools against the aviation, academia, communications, government, and energy industries, which this alert also included indicators that were used by this activity. Now, we think that these operations are part of a suspected UNC 3313 campaign that's targeting the telecommunications and travel sector. Now, we also saw that there was a campaign that continued to use the Ngite file sharing link. So they usually muddy water will either use like OneDrive accounts, any cloud storage accounts, Google Drive. They'll send you like a spear phishing link to access the tool and download the tool so you can, get the support or basically answer whatever questions they have or provide any kind of assistance. That's their bread and butter pretty much. Now, I'll tell you one thing, management panels for remote access tools such as Simple Help, for example, or what one tool they're using called Tactical RMM, they were also observed on identified server ports, but we did not identify any samples of these tools. But the Tactical RMM, which is their own custom tool, we've identified that's been used by muddy water clusters and muddy water activity that continues to happen to this day. So not only are they using both their own RMM tools, they're also using legitimate RMM tools to continue their campaigns. And these are impacting entities in a wide range of industries and regions. And we anticipate that the actor will continue to use these various tools at their disposal to accomplish their objectives. So these are just some examples of the devastating impact that RMM exploitation can have on organizations. Next slide, please. So what are the known vulnerabilities in RMMs? I mean, believe it or not, it's pretty simple. It's either unpatched software, weak authentication, misconfigurations, ODAs, RCEs, and privilege escalation vulnerabilities. So for the unpatched software, it's basically the failure to apply any security updates to your RMM platforms, which leaves them susceptible to vulnerabilities. Weak authentication, I mean, if you're basically not using 2FA, I mean, you're cooked pretty much. Misconfigurations, and this is pretty common in a lot of environments that I've been with. If an RMM is not configured properly, these tools can grant attackers unauthorized access and elevate privileges. Now, the things that we can't control, but we try our best to, are like zero-day vulnerabilities. If there's a zero-day vulnerability in RMM software, that can be exploited by attackers before a patch is available. And then, of course, you have your remote code execution vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities allow the attackers to execute malicious code on a vulnerable system, granting them remote control capabilities. And then you have privilege escalation vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities enable the attackers to elevate their privileges within the system, potentially gaining access to sensitive data. So you got to understand that understanding these vulnerabilities, and these are, again, simple things that you can do right now. It's crucial for implementing the necessary security measures and to secure your RMM tools. So like Bernie's saying here, he's just asking you nicely to change your default password on your RMM tool. Pretty much it. Next slide, please. So what are the common exploitation techniques that are used? Again, pretty simple, pretty common stuff. Nothing like fancy out of this world, with the exception of one in this bullet point. So you obviously have phishing attacks, right? These threat actors will target IT personnel with emails containing malicious links and attachments that compromise their credentials and potentially grant access to RMM consoles. Then you have supply chain attacks, which is, I think, the most dangerous and probably the most challenging for anyone to detect. And normally the only guys I've ever seen, I think we all seen it, the only ones that are very good at like supply chain attacks are usually your nation state threat actors. So you got, actors that'll infiltrate the software and development platforms of third-party vendors to inject vulnerabilities into RMM tools, affecting a large number of users at once. Then you have watering hole attacks. So this is another one where the attackers will target websites that IT folks use, and they'll deliver the malware that can exploit the vulnerabilities in RMM software. And then you got good old brute force attacks, right? Because like that early one with Bernie, that Bernie said, just change your default password. If you're using RMM software and your password is, John12345, winky face, an actor can probably try to crack the weak passwords on RMM accounts, granting them access. And an interesting one is lateral movement. So let's say it wasn't the RMM tool that was exploited first, but it was exploited later during the campaign. So once the attackers will gain a foothold within the network through, compromised RMM access, they'll use these tools to move laterally, and then they'll try to affect other systems. So next slide, please. Oh, actually, go back one. I forgot to mention about TTPs. Apologies on that one. Also, I wanted to talk about TTPs that are used by these threat actors to exploit remote management software. So some of the things they do is they'll exploit weak or default credentials, which is kind of something I mentioned before. They'll also alter device configurations. So this will include like changing the passwords, create new users, and manipulate human machine interface controls as well. So the other thing is they'll also try to do is they'll use publicly available tools and scripts to steal credentials. they'll deploy also their ransomware payloads. Like the case of VSA attack, they basically, once they compromise the RMM, they basically deployed their own ransomware as well. They'll attempt privilege escalation, so through vulnerability exploitation, either DAPI, or they'll do Kerberos roasting attacks. And then lastly, they'll also at times install their own remote administration tools to maintain access into the victim environment. So that's kind of some of the TTPs as well that we're seeing with these threat actors. Next slide, please. And then the last part I have here is basically the recommended key takeaways, right? So maintain basically a strong security hygiene, right? Patch your RMM software, all your connected systems, implement MFA, and all accounts for access to within the RMM platform. I mean, this is probably the top one I would say. It's probably the easiest one to do is the patch management and the MFA as well. Then if you want to dive deeper into the RMM tools, because they do offer security features, you could utilize those features in the RMM tools, like least privilege controls or activity monitoring or user access monitoring. Another thing too, audit, right? Conduct regular security assessments, access those configurations for vulnerabilities, and then implement your best practices. If you can, segment it, right? Limit the access to only authorized personnel, which normally I would assume that, RMM tools are going to be used by particularly the IT department, maybe the vulnerability management team, but make sure that you're limiting that access to those appropriate people. And when someone leaves your organization, make sure that that account is immediately removed. Some other more technical things would be to implement network traffic analysis. So this is where you're basically, Wireshark or any kind of network monitoring tool for anomalous behavior that might indicate some unauthorized access attempts. And then also monitor your users. So implement some user activity monitoring people that have suspicious logging attempts or activity within the RMM platform. Like, let's say you have Bob from accounting that, he has access to the RMM and he's leaving for Friday to go to his honeymoon or his wedding in, Copacabana. But then you see Bob is logged in at 10 o'clock at night. It's like, well, that's weird. Bob's supposed to be, out of town. What's he doing around here? So make sure you monitor that. And then also, the last bullet, utilize endpoint detection and response solutions, or EDR. I know with CrowdStrike recently, a lot of people kind of have a bad taste in their mouth about EDRs, but just so you know, Binary Defense also have our own EDR solution called Vision that you can learn more about it from our sales and marketing folks. And with that, I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time, guys. Open discussion right now. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask. Thanks again, all.
All right. Let's see. Let me stop sharing. I think there is one question. Yep. Okay, so the question is, what's the risk assessment of TeamViewer in light of the recent disclosed attacks by threat actors?
I mean, currently right now, like I said, with a lot of these remote management tools, the risk is I would say the risk is moderate to high, but I would stick it at moderate because a lot of these threat actors, and it's not just TeamViewer, it's all the RMMs that are out there. Because like I said, the RMMs are basically fancy rats. So if the threat actor is able to compromise the RMM, like actually compromise the RMM, that's a big risk. That's why when I was talking about the Screen Connect issue with that happened earlier in 2024 with APT 29, if they were able to, fortunately they were detected, right? But it's reason to assess or assume that they were actually probably trying to get into the supply chain and understand more about that particular software and kind of do the same thing that they did with SolarWinds. So I hope that answered your question, Matt.
Thanks, JP.
Yep.
That is the only question. So again, thank you everyone for joining today and tuning into this monthly Threat Talk, and we'll see you next month. Y'all have a good one. Bye-bye.
Have a good one, guys. See ya.